Right. I'm Rod Ewing, the president of the Mineralogical Society of America, and it's my pleasure to open this session, which is a session to honor Mike Hochella by presenting him with the Dana Medal. The Dana Medal is a new award, relatively new award for the Society. Mike is only the second recipient of this award. And the award was created to recognize outstanding contributions by original research in mineral sciences by an individual in the midst of their career, not the midst of their career, but in the middle of their career. And certainly in a relatively short time, Mike has distinguished himself in a number of different areas in the mineral sciences. The award is named for the two Danas, J.D. Dana, James Dwight Dana. You know from the Manual of Mineralogy, which is now, I think, in its 23rd edition case? 22nd, okay, but I'm sure the 23rd is in the making. The 22nd edition, you know the authors, Case Klein and Hurlbut. The second Dana is the son, E.S. Dana, known for his textbook of mineralogy, and he was also an honorary president of MSA. So we honor the truly groundbreaking work of Mike with the names on this medal, which represent really some of the original American mineralogists and some very, very important contributions. So let me introduce then the citationist, Bob Bodner, who is a professor at Virginia Tech and colleague to Mike.
President Ewing, members of the Mineralogical Society of America, friends and guests, it's a pleasure to present to you the recipient of the Mineralogical Society of America Dana Medal for 2002, Dr. Michael F. Hochella, Jr. of Virginia Tech. The Dana Medal is intended to recognize continued outstanding scientific contributions through original research in the mineralogical sciences by an individual in the midst of their career. The Mineralogical Society of America Dana Medal was established in 1998 and named in 2000 in honor of the legendary contributions by James Dwight Dana and Edward Salisbury Dana to the science of mineralogy. Mike Hochella carries on the legacy of these mineralogical pioneers through his own outstanding contributions to the science of mineralogy. Mike Hochella received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Virginia Tech and his PhD from Stanford University, where his supervisor was another Virginia Tech alumnus and former president of the Mineralogical Society of America, Gordon Brown. After working for a short time as a senior scientist at Corning Research, Mike joined the faculty at Stanford and remained there until 1992, when we were successful in recruiting Mike to join the faculty at Virginia Tech. This event assured that Virginia Tech would maintain its position of prominence in the mineralogical sciences that was established by Mike's teachers and later colleagues at Virginia Tech, Don Bloss, Paul Ribby, and Jerry Gibbs, all outstanding mineralogists and former presidents of the Mineralogical Society of America. The Dana Medal is a mid-career award, and the quantity and especially the quality of Mike's contributions are indeed exceptional for a mid-career scientist. The significance of these contributions is enhanced further when one considers that Mike is actually early in his mid-career phase. For those of us in the science, this is great news because it means we can look forward to many years of novel and exciting scientific advances from Mike, his students, and co-workers. While Mike's research covers a broad spectrum of mineralogy and geochemistry, all of his work involves the application of the most advanced analytical techniques and theoretical models to solving fundamental problems in the earth sciences. Mike has been one of the pioneers in applying modern analytical techniques in mineralogy. He was one of the first mineralogists to utilize Auger and X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy to study the composition and bonding of mineral and silicate glass surfaces, as well as the dissolution of minerals. Mike led a research effort that used Auger microscopy and TEM to unravel the chemical and mineralogical nature of gold in pyrite in the economically important Carlin type or invisible gold deposits. Using state-of-the-art surface analysis by laser ionization mass spectrometry, Mike and Tracy Tingle tackled the politically charged issue of mantle hydrocarbons and showed conclusively that carbon in mantle xenoliths was not consistent with the formation of deep methane that was being proselytized by Professor Thomas Gold and his colleagues. Mike and his students carried out some of the first STM and AFM studies of mineral surfaces before and after reactions with metal ion containing aqueous solutions. The resulting STM images of metal oxide and metal sulfide surfaces showed, for the first time, remarkable atomic level detail about surface defects and surface reaction products. Mike and his students have gone on to become the world leaders in scanning force microscopy studies of mineral surface geochemistry. More recently, Mike and his students have begun to develop a fundamental theoretical framework to interpret surface reaction processes. These first principle quantum chemical calculations are providing valuable and unexpected insights into fluid-mineral interactions at the molecular scale. While Mike Hochella's scientific contributions are well known to mineralogists and geochemists, and all would agree that Mike has been an extremely successful scientist, it is noteworthy that his success has not come at the expense of his students, postdocs, co-workers, and family. Mike maintains a balanced lifestyle and makes sure that he allows sufficient quality time to spend with his children, Michael and Catherine, and wife Barbara. Mike recognizes the value and values the need for students to not become consumed by their work and encourages his students to work hard, be the best scientists that they can be, but also have a life outside of the geosciences. All who know Mike agree that he is an uncommonly generous person and considerate of the needs and desires of his students as individuals. I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge these qualities that make Mike not only a great advisor of students, but also a valued and respected colleague. Mike treats his students as equals and professionals and provides mentoring to help them develop as scientists. Mike lets his students come up with their own projects, while he provides valuable guidance about which projects won't work or that nobody cares about. He puts enormous faith in the creativity of his students. Many of the crazy ideas he allowed his students to pursue have ended up breaking new ground. It does not bother Mike to sometimes take chances. He's never controlling, but rather works hard to motivate his students without pushing too hard. Mike recognizes that each student's circumstances are unique. If a graduate student has a family, Mike encourages them to make time for family, and he recognizes that there may be periods of time when external commitments result in lower productivity from the student than he would like. Mike does not adhere to a one-size-fits-all philosophy, but rather lets each student develop according to his or her own abilities and circumstances. This humanitarian approach has clearly been successful, as evidenced by the quality of Mike's current and former students, many of whom have gone on to become respected scientists and educators in this country and abroad. The care and attention to detail that characterize all of Mike's activities is illustrated by a comment that was provided by one of Mike's former students, who described her earliest memory of working with Mike in the lab. Mike was teaching her how to operate the XPS, and he was very systematic and methodical in explaining each step. Close this, because. Open that, because. This does that. That does this. Turn that up very slowly, because. The student quickly gained confidence that she could operate the instrument because Mike completely believed in her and her ability to do so. And he explained everything so clearly along the way that nothing was a mystery. This is a fine example of the way in which Mike attacks all scientific problems, carefully, methodically, systematically. The student concluded her comments by saying that she felt like she was learning to fly an airplane. This, of course, makes perfect sense because one of Mike's passions in life beyond science is flying airplanes. In closing, I'd like to tell a story that was sent to me by another student, who shall remain anonymous, that in many ways is characteristic of Mike Hochella, the person. We all know that Mike adheres to the highest ethical and professional standards and would never intentionally do anything that is illegal or unprofessional. On the other hand, we also know that Mike's very trusting of his friends and close colleagues and believes that no one would ever lead him astray. Well, several years ago, Mike was attending a conference at Penn State when some friends asked Mike if he'd like to go fly fishing. Of course, Mike replied. So Mike and a few others went off to the local stream to fish for trout, and Mike was having a grand old time, although not catching any fish. When Mike asked one of the people who went along why she wasn't fishing, her reply was, "Well, I don't have a fishing license." At which point Mike's eyes bugged out and he exclaimed, "You mean you need a license to fish?" He promptly pulled out the fishing rod, while his friends, in quotation marks, sensing his concern and uneasiness, started regaling him with stories of huge fines and overnight jail stays with Bubba for fishing illegally. Everyone thought it was quite amusing that Mike didn't know he needed a license to fly fish. He had completely trusted his friends and could not imagine that they would lead him astray. And you know who that's from. All jocularity aside, it's clear that James and Edward Dana would be pleased to see this award, named in their honor, being presented to Mike Hochella. They would be comfortable knowing that the award has gone to not only an outstanding mineralogist, but also to someone who has worked tirelessly to promote the society and its science. They can rest assured that with practitioners of the quality of Mike Hochella, the future of mineralogy is in capable hands. Mr. President, members of the Society, and others, it's with great pleasure that I present to you the recipient of the Mineralogical Society of America Dana Medal for 2002, Michael F. Hochella, Jr.
So, Mike, on behalf of the Mineralogical Society of America, I'm very pleased to present you with the Dana Medal. We're waiting for the battery to charge.
You can put that up in a moment, Bob. Just turn that off for now. Thanks very much, Bob, for those incredibly generous remarks. President Ewing and colleagues gathered here today, I'll just take 4 or 5 minutes to do this acceptance, and then we'll go on to the really good part, the science. Although I must say I'm relishing in this moment. Thank you very much. You bring back lots of wonderful memories. I read a few years ago a magazine article about a reporter who asked a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry what it took to win a Nobel Prize. And I never forgot his answer. He said it took 3 things. First thing is that being a genius is definitely not required. You could be reasonably intelligent, that was fine. Second thing was that you had to work hard. And I remember thinking at that point, geez, just about every scientist that I've ever known definitely fit those 2 criteria. So I was waiting with bated breath as to what this magical third thing would be. And his third item was that you have to be in the right place at the right time, and you have to be very, very, very fortunate to win any sort of a scientific prize, which is why I never really expected to be here one day doing what I'm doing now. Not the least of which also is the times in my career when I've been criticized. I remember one in particular when someone called me a dilettante geochemist, and that must have really struck a nerve because I am immediately fired back, knowing that I would probably regret it one day, and said, "Don't you ever call me a geochemist." Well, I'd like to add to that article I read and add a 4th thing that it takes to win any sort of an academic scientific prize anyway, and that is that it's absolutely imperative that you have a good group, an exceptional group of graduate students and postdocs. And you can turn that on now because, as Bob mentioned, the success of our group is measured in their success, not mine. And these are all of them in gory detail. At national labs and research institutes, there's Dirk Bosbach, you see there at the upper left, who is at the Institute for National Waste Disposal in Germany. And if you go to the bottom of that list, Paul Versine is the equivalent institution in Switzerland. And then going back up, Kevin Rosso at PNNL, who's a very fast-rising star there. Tracy Tingle, I miss dearly. He was in his 30s, got melanoma, and didn't make it. So he died a few years ago. And be sad the rest of my life on that particular point. Rob Weaver is at the McCrone Research Institute in Chicago. Fascinating place. Look at the faculty that have come from our group. Udo Becker, who's a professor at University of Münster right now, where I am on sabbatical, just accepted an associate professorship at Michigan, so he'll be a colleague of Rod's very soon. Barry Bickmore is on a tenure track at BYU. Trish Dove, who many of you know, got tenure at Georgia Tech, and we wooed her to Virginia Tech. Craig Eggleston is tenured at Wyoming. Stephen Lauer just started his academic career at Maryland, with a big splash, I might add. Patricia Maurice is tenured at Notre Dame. John Rakoven is on a tenure track at Miami. Chris Tadmir is a research professor at Virginia Tech. And Susan Stipp, very first student, is an associate professor at Copenhagen. On the societies side, Jody Rosso is the Paul Ribby equivalent for the Geochemical Society. She's the series editor. And she's, of course, married to Kevin. He works at PNNL. She stays at home with 2 young children and edits reviews in mineralogy and geochemistry now. But she's a really super talented scientist. And then the current students in the lab are Trevor Kendall, Andy Madden, Aaron O'Reilly, and Tracy Kale. And it won't surprise you to hear me say this, but this was actually in my prepared remarks, and I had no idea what Bob was going to say, but this is not my group. This is not my lab. This is our group. This is our lab. And these people have been extraordinarily successful because they are truly that talented. So my hat's off to all of them. I'll end with a quick family story. As Bob said, I'm married to Professor Barbara Becken, and we have 2 amazing children, Michael and Catherine. I'm 48 years old now, but our oldest child, Michael the younger, is only 10. And he is a slow reader, and spelling in English makes absolutely no sense to him. So he's a lot like his dad. And he loves to ask questions. He's incredibly curious. And about 2 weeks ago, it's a true story, but 2 weeks ago he said, "Dad, what's the relative flying speed of a 737 versus a 747? And actually, I happen to know that, so I told him. And then, just right on the heels of my answering that question, he said, "What's the Dana metal made out of?" Because I had mentioned to him that I was going to get this metal. And I actually knew that too, because I looked it up on the website, and it happens to list the compositions. So I said very proudly to him, "Well, it's made out of bronze." And he immediately fired back, "Well then, who came in first and second?" So to 2 of my heroes, James and Edward Dana, whose brilliance in mineralogy and especially mineral classification has withstood the test of time for over 100 years, which is astounding. To MSA, that I consider the premier mineralogical society in the world. And even though I've been president of the Geochemical Society, I still consider this my home society for sure. To Rod Ewing, who I consider to be a visionary president of MSA, and I'm really glad to see him in this role. To Bob Bodner and Gordon Brown, who are the 2 principal nominators of me for this award, whose scientific careers I look up to with nothing short of amazement. To the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and Petroleum Research Funds, who have been more than generous to us and very consistent in their funding of our lab. I thank you all for this remarkable gift. It's certainly one I will always cherish. Thank you very much. next revolution will be or so. Okay, switch gears here and talk about some science for 30 minutes. The title of this talk, as Rod said, is Nanoscience and Technology, the Next Revolution, the Earth and Environmental Sciences. And I don't say that lightly. I actually believe this. I may be wrong, but I actually truly believe this after thinking about it for the last few years. On this picture, I show the Earth-Moon system on the left. I show a scanning tunneling microscope image of atoms on a mineral surface on the right. And I want to start by saying that it's this system in the nano range which is truly going to dramatically impact that system and the other way around. It certainly goes both ways. If you look in everything from the Washington Post to the New York Times to certainly many aspects of the scientific literature, you see nano everywhere. You can start up here in the upper right by looking at the breakthrough of the year as voted on by science editors last year, 2001, as being nanocircuits, to government reports from various agencies about nanoscience that are very recent, to this magazine that recently came out. It was launched just last year on the business aspects of nanoscience and technology, to professional magazines like MRS Bulletin, new aspects of nanocrystalline research, and so on and so forth. It goes on and on. I just took a few to give you examples of these things. And the question that I want to answer, or that I want to ask during this talk, is how will the Earth and environmental sciences respond to what seems to be an amazing crest of interest in these fields? And so I'm going to answer that question in the next 25 minutes or so, and we're going to do it in a number of ways. I'm going to start with, well, I guess you'd say introductory textbook level kind of things, to put nanoscience in a framework. And I always start with the simplest possible things, and this is right down to the fundamentals. So I'm going to do that first, put nanoscience in a dimensional framework, and then I'm going to define nanoscience for you. In fact, when I first started to read about this, 5 or 8 years ago, I thought I was a scientist. I thought I already was a nanoscientist. I was not. In the last 5 years, I've sort of discovered for myself anyway what nanoscience is, what its foundations are, what its underpinnings are, and hopefully where it's going to go in the future, at least for the earth sciences. And I'm going to describe my view of that next. Then I'm going to tell you how we study nanoscience, and then obviously give you some examples in the earth sciences. Some very just broad brush examples, and then one specific example to end the talk. So let's go and do that right now. The dimensional frame is this, the scale of the universe, which every time I look at amazes me. You've got the most distant galaxies at 10 to the 26 meters from Earth, as, 10 billion light years away, a number that's unimaginably large. You've got just the size of our Milky Way galaxy. This is an infrared image of the core of our galaxy at 10 to the 21 meters in diameter. You've got, in this case, a supernova, 10 to the 16 meters, which is about 1 light year across from side to side. The size of the sun. The scale of the earth sciences tucks nicely in here, and then you go down to small particles. The reason I have this arrow here is because we can't measure things smaller than about 10 to the minus 18 meters. So that's why this scale stops here. But in fact, the physicists that study fundamental particles tell us the best they can model these things now using string theory, using the grand unified theories, is that fundamental particles, like smaller ones like X bosons, for example, go down to somewhere on the order of 10 to the minus 30 to 10 to the minus 35 meters. And so, do you know what this means? This means that inner space, if it's, say, 10 to the minus 30 or 35, is actually more vast than outer space. You know, we didn't need Carl Sagan to tell us that these numbers are unimaginable. Well, down here, they're even more unimaginable. Okay? Now, as far as the earth sciences, we're going to go in this range right here where the earth sciences are. At first glance, it looks much less exciting in terms of scale. We're only going from about 10 to the 9 meters in the Earth-Moon system down through into the negatives, the size of minerals, the size of bacteria, the size of molecules, and the size of atoms at 10 to the minus 10. What is so special about the nanoscale? Because the nanoscale is generally thought to be, well, a nanometer is 10 to the minus 9, but the nanoscale bridges about 2 orders of magnitude in here. What's so special about this? Because after all, the Braggs were solving the positions of these things in real space in 1912. And we've been doing a lot of this ever since, obviously. So what's so special about this particular range of this enormous dimensional scale? And what's so new about it? Okay, that's what I want to answer for you right now. Maybe the first time you read anything about nanoscience, it was, what, 5 or 8 years ago? Maybe some of you a little bit earlier. This work is nanoscience. It's done by geochemists, and it comes from the 1960s. They didn't call it nanoscience then. All of this stuff was couched in different terms. But as I look back through the literature, I find stuff like this all over the place. And what this describes here is a mineral surface with small microparticles on that mineral surface. These smallest mineral dust particles would be in the nano range, about 10 to the minus 8 or 9 meters. And the geochemists that were doing these studies saw that these tiny specks dissolved very rapidly, where the bulk minerals, or the large-scale mineral surface dissolved relatively slowly. So if you look at the particle radius of a mineral that you want to dissolve, and I plotted it here for quartz. This example is specifically made for quartz. If you had a quartz sphere at 10 to the minus 7 meters diameter, 10 to the minus 8, 10 to the minus 9, so this would be 1 nanometer, 10 nanometers, 100 nanometers. If you were dissolving pieces of quartz that small, you would notice that at 100 nanometers, that piece of quartz dissolves at about the same rate as a piece of quartz that's a centimeter on a side. It doesn't really matter. And that's shown by this function here, S over S naught, which is the solubility of quartz with a radius of R, whatever R you want to be. And S0 is the solubility of quartz in the bulk state. So when S over S naught is 1, like it is here, and at larger dimensions, there's nothing special about how quartz dissolves. It doesn't matter what size the quartz crystal is. It'll dissolve at the same rate. But as you make the quartz crystal smaller and smaller and smaller, its solubility starts to rise as expressed by this equation, which it's not even necessary to get into this modified form of the Kelvin equation, but you can find this equation in lots of physical chemistry books. And by the time you get to a quartz crystal that's 10 nanometers in size to 1 nanometer in size, its solubility has gone up 1 order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude, almost 3 orders of magnitude. I don't know if you've ever done solubility studies, but that's a lot. And it's very easily measured. So we're seeing something really bizarre here. We're seeing a physical property of, in this case, a mineral change just as a function of size. That's all. I want to put this in a very broad context. As I went through school, I was really amazed at simple equations like this that were foundations for whole fields of science. Equations that certainly in foresight took near geniuses to come up with, and in hindsight still are very difficult to put a finger on. But they tell us so much. Like F equals ma for Newtonian physics, or the Schrödinger equation, or Bragg's law, or this is my favorite, the matter-wave duality of nature, the de Broglie equation that's equating energy with mass. Is there such an equation for nanoscience? It seems to me that there should be, and if someone knows about it, let me know. I certainly can't come up with one, but I can come up with a functionality that expresses these sorts of things in a very simple expression. And that functionality is this. Nanoscience tells us that the property I of a material Q, that's this, is a function of its size in 3 dimensions. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later that you only have to restrict one of these 3 dimensions, or 2, or all 3, to get property changes like we saw with quartz. You don't have to restrict all 3. So it's these properties are a function just of size, but of all 3 dimensions. Example, out of material science, although this is actually a mineral. I forget the name, but cadmium sulfide is a mineral. And these are nano-sized crystals of cadmium sulfide that the inventors call quantum dots. Probably, maybe even read about this in the New York Times or so, because they have tremendous potential in nanoscience application to the biological sciences, in fact, to the medical sciences. The reason they do is because these tiny, tiny crystals, this is 5 nanometers for scale, these tiny crystals that are semiconducting to slightly insulating, when excited by electromagnetic radiation, will fluoresce one wavelength. And the wavelength that they fluoresce in, this monochromatic radiation that they fluoresce with, is a function of their size. Only their size. The physical properties of these materials change dramatically with size. Not just what I just said, but melting temperature. The melting temperature of a macro or a large crystal of cadmium sulfide is 1600 degrees centigrade. You can go in the lab and measure it very easily. But if you grew nano-sized crystals of cadmium sulfide, you could also easily measure the melting temperature at 400 degrees. Transformation pressure. This is where the cadmium goes from 4 to 6-fold coordination. It takes 2 GPa to do this transformation if the crystal's large. But if you get the crystal in the nano domain, the transformation pressure goes up to 9 GPa. The band gap. This seems like the most subtle of the 3, but it's actually the most important for this biomedical application, because this band gap is controlling the wavelength of the energy that these things emit when excited. The band gap goes from 2.5 eV to 4.5 eV. A tremendous change, almost a factor of 2. The electronic structure of this material is changing as a function of size. Does this happen with earth materials? Of course it does. It depends on the specific material, it depends on the specific property that you're measuring. And if that's the case, then if nanoparticles are prevalent in our atmospheres, in the hydrosphere of the Earth and the solid Earth, then we're onto something here. And in fact, I'll show you later in the talk, they're everywhere. These nanoparticles, once you look, and you know what you're looking for now that we have a reason to look for them, once you look, you find these things everywhere. Last sort of theoretical slide before I get on to some actual examples. Here I've plotted particle size in meters. So here's 1 nanometer here. Here's 10 nanometers. Here's 1 angstrom. As a function of some arbitrary property measurement. Just fill it in whatever your favorite property is. And at room temperature, you'll be measuring this property of this material as it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and all of a sudden that property starts to change and starts to change dramatically. Why does that happen? I mean, there are lots of ways to think of this. I've read papers that talk about it from a thermodynamic point of view. I've read papers that talk about it from a structure chemistry point of view. I like to think of things as electronic. I like to think of things, fundamentally speaking, the thing that really controls the whole ball of wax, the thing that if you had a book it would be labeled, it's all in here, the electronic properties of material, because that's what controls the bonding. And so let's just look at the valence band. If you have a single atom or a very small molecule like CO2, you can look at the valence band of that material, where the electrons that participate in bonds and non-bonding orbitals, bonding and non-bonding orbitals, And you see very discrete energy levels. This is energy versus density of states, or population, if you will. You see very discrete energy levels. And this is not a model. You can measure this with photoelectron spectroscopy, no problem. That's why it won a Nobel Prize. So this is for a material that's very small, like a very small molecule. But if you make that same material bigger, what happens to these discrete energy bands? They become smeared out. What happens to these discrete energy levels? They become smeared out into wider and wider bands, so that when you get up to what we call sort of bulk, these energy levels are now smeared into a band. And that's why physicists call this band theory, because they use band theory to explain this sort of smearing out. And there's another smearing phenomenon. It has to do with temperature, as described by the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution of energy levels as a function of temperature. So you have this sort of overriding factor as well. As the temperature goes up, the smearing due to thermal energy goes up as well. That's why when you go to higher temperatures, the place where a property will start to change will actually become smaller and smaller and smaller in dimensional space. We're in good shape here in the earth sciences, at least on the Earth's surface, because we're dealing with this temperature. And the dimension at which properties start to change is relatively large compared to where they would start to change at higher temperature. Okay, that's enough of that sort of thing. How do we do nanoscience? Lots of ways. A lot of people credit the scanning tunneling microscope as the first instrument that specifically looked at nano-sized things. That's not entirely true. It's a convenient way for historians to put it down. But TEM has been around for a long time, and people have been studying nano-sized things with that for decades. Nevertheless, scanning tunneling microscope is obviously extremely important. Photoelectron spectroscopies and AES and SIMS, X-ray absorption spectroscopy, extremely important in nanoscience. Atomic force microscopy, computational chemistry, and let's not forget the things that they've known for hundreds of years. Solution chemistry, yes, you can get a lot of very, very valuable nanoscience information from solution chemistry. And the final thing, since we are all earth scientists after all, you got to get out here and you got to dig around, get samples, and do. This is where nanoscience starts, I think. And this is one of our field trips last summer. I'll be showing you some nanoscience results from this field trip later in this talk. Okay, this is where PowerPoint conversion from PCs to Macs failed, so I have an overhead of this particular one. I'm going to give you, in the next 5 minutes or so, some examples of nano-size things in nature and show you how variable they are and how many things they impinge upon in the earth sciences. I'd like to start with this paper by Busick and others on atmospheric nanoaerosols. Their paper was not on just nano, but this is a component of their paper. This is a crystal of sea salt. It was collected in the troposphere at an elevation of something like 10 kilometers or so. And it's crystals of sulfate, again, as a result of evaporating seawater from sea splash at the surface. And these small particles form and work their way up into our atmosphere. These things, we don't know a lot about them. But we do know that they have a lot to do with radiation scattering in our atmosphere, so therefore they have a lot to do with global warming and cooling. In fact, these materials are thought to not warm the Earth, but in fact keep us cooler. They have a lot to do with cloud nucleation. They have a lot to do with the heterogeneous chemistry that goes on these surfaces. The chemistry of chlorine in the atmosphere, sulfur, nitrogen, have a lot to do with reactions that happen on these nanocrystal surfaces. We know virtually nothing about those reactions. We know that they should be important. They are going to be studied long into the future, believe me. Nanofilms. So that was a particle, a nano-sized particle that's restricted in all 3 dimensions. All 3 dimensions are small, and it falls into the nano regime. Here's an example of a nanomaterial where only one dimension is restricted. And therefore, we've discovered here a nanofilm. So we have two extensive directions, one very small dimension. This nanofilm is just one example of ones that we found, is from a mantle xenolith. This is olivine from San Carlos, Arizona. And if you break open these xenoliths, mostly olivine crystals, you find a very sort of strange fluorescence, or iridescence, sorry, on these surfaces. And if you look at this with nothing more than an SEM with an EDAX that has a carbon analyzer, you find out that these surfaces are covered with carbon. And if you do more sophisticated instrumental things, we discover that these things are only 1 nanometer to 2 nanometers thick. And that's why they were missed all these years. And then we discover that these things contain organic molecules that go up to atomic mass weights of several hundred. And then we discover, through a lot of other things, that these things are abiotic. And so again, these carbon nanofilms are mysterious. They're incredibly interesting, and I just show it to you here as an example of a nanofilm. These things have also a lot to do with the conductivity of rocks in the lower crust and upper mantle, so geophysicists are very interested in them. That was a 2D nanofilm. How about a 2D crystal? This is not from nature. This is from a lab. But these things will grow the same way in nature, given the right conditions. You have a calcite surface here. This is microns per scale now. So this is an atomic force microscope image. And there are tiny crystals of schurpite, which is a uranium oxyhydroxide hydrate, and of great interest to people that study nuclear disposal and breaching of nuclear disposal into nature. And these schurpite crystals are, wow, they're about a micron or so across in X and Y. But these crystals, in fact, this crystal, can you believe it? This crystal is just 2 unit cells thick. So it's a mile across and 1 inch thick. This crystal, and this very high crystal, is a whopping 5 unit cells thick. It's about 50, 60 angstroms thick. What are the nature of these crystals that we call schurpite relative to the bulk schurpite you can hold in your hand? We don't know. We don't know what kind of surface chemistry goes on there. We don't know how the size of the crystal is affecting the way this thing is reacting in nature. But we better find out, because these phases have a lot to do, as I said, with nuclear waste disposal. Oops. Okay. Yeah. Nano patches. I like nano because you can use it for a prefix for anything. Image by Kevin Rosso in our group of Pyrite 100. This is a scanning tunneling microscope image. Each one of these bumps here is an individual iron atom. You can't see the sulfur dimers in between because the tunneling conditions aren't right for that. So we're just looking at iron here. And as you start to oxidize the surface, this again is not a natural, this is a natural specimen, but we are oxidizing it in a vacuum under very controlled conditions. You start getting these nano-sized patches, about 2 nanometers on X and Y, and maybe a 0.5 nanometer thick, of some sort of pyrite oxidation product, iron sulfate product. Again, the physical characteristics, the chemistry that these things can do, or that they would promote on their surfaces, is not known. We just know that they're there. Nanotubes. Got this idea from a paper that Banfield and Barker published in GCA in '94, and Jill and I have since written a book chapter on this more recently. Here we have an amphibole weathering to a smectite. So this is a surface weathering phenomenon, an amphibole weathering to a clay mineral under Earth's surface conditions. And as one goes to the other, there are nanotubes there, that's what these arrows are pointing to. Little tubes that go through that interface that are only nanometer in dimension in 2 of their dimensions and extensive in the other one. And I got to thinking, what is water like in a space that small? What are solvated ions like in a space that small? And when I started looking through the physics and chemistry literature, I found some amazing things, to me anyway, that indicated that this is grossly different than the kind of chemistry that would happen in bulk water. And I thought that this must have a lot to do with the transformation of this mineral to this mineral. After all, the components that amphibole has, the chemical components that amphibole has that smectite doesn't need, have to get out through these nanotubes. And the components that amphibole doesn't have that smectite needs to grow have to come in. So again, just a very brief example of which we wrote an extensive chapter on. Nanomechanics. Some of the more recent work from our group, from Stephen Lauer. Minerals and microbes have had a love affair for well over 3 billion years on this planet. Microbes affect the way minerals behave, and minerals certainly affect the way microbes behave. In this experiment, you can put a bacterial cell or a number of cells on an atomic force microscope cantilever, and instead of making an image, all you're doing is making a force measurement. You're bringing the microbe down to the surface and letting it contact, and then you're pulling it apart. Sounds really simple. It's very hard to do in practice, but it's doable. And you can measure these force distance curves, force distance. And I love this. I sort of call this our nano-nano work, because it's nanometers of distance between the microbe surface and the mineral as you bring them closer and closer and then pull them apart with nanometer control. And force on the y-axis in nanonewtons. And we could talk the whole lecture just on this one plot, but let me just point out this blue curve right here. This is the pulling apart curve. This is the kind of curve that you get if you literally could, walking down the Washington sidewalk and you stepped on a piece of chewing gum and you pulled your feet away, and you know how everyone has had this happen to them, and the strings of the gum stretch and finally break. And this is exactly the kind of curve that you would measure, except we're doing this in the nanoscale for, in this case, iron reductase proteins on the surface of this bacteria, which are very interested in this mineral surface as an electron acceptor, and how those proteins interact with that surface and how you pull the two apart. And in this case, Stephen was actually able to identify the protein between these two entities by looking at the nanomechanics. Okay, to conclude my talk, I want to give one specific example of how you can take nanoscience and do something more or less practical with it. This example comes from our work in Montana. Sorry about this. I've given this talk a few times in Europe, but I presumably all of you know where Montana is. It's a big state, though. The Butte Anaconda area, about 150 years ago, was utilized for mining. In fact, the Berkeley pit in Butte, Montana, became the largest open pit copper mine in the world for quite some time. It's not anymore. The Clark Fork River starts in the Butte Anaconda area, flows over great length through Montana and eventually into the Columbia River. The sad news about this is that this area is the largest Superfund site in the United States. Actually, it's 4 Superfund sites. When you put them all 4 together, they're all caused by this mining activity. You've got 1,600 square kilometers of highly contaminated land. What in the world could nanoscience have to do with any of this? Let's look. Here's ground zero, 0 kilometers. Here's Butte, Montana. Here's the Berkeley pit that's filling up with water now, which is a big problem. You have a lot of these dump piles and smelter and tailings piles all over the place. You go 30 kilometers from Butte, this picture here, the headwaters of the spectacular Clark Fork River, well, not at its headwaters, although this area's been cleaned up quite a bit in just the last few years, at a cost of tens to probably almost $100 million already. 190 kilometers downstream, this is the first dam that you get to, just upstream from the town of Missoula, Montana, where the University of Montana is. And you look at data from Johnny Moore, my colleague at the University of Montana, who knows this system better than anybody on the planet. And what you're seeing here is distance downstream from the mining area here, and as a function of enrichment factor for arsenic, copper, and zinc in bed sediments along the Clark Fork River. And you can see that 190 kilometers, I don't know how fast you drive, but it takes me 2 hours to drive that at interstate speeds. And I don't think, they didn't have a speed limit in Montana for a long time, so you can really zip down this thing. It takes 2 hours to drive here. And look at the enrichment factors for these toxic metals. That far away from the mining site, you've got, well, let's see, for zinc, you're still at almost 26 times the background zinc concentration in streams that come, tributaries that come into the Clark Fork that far downstream. You can go 550 kilometers downstream and still find enrichment factors of 2 to 3 times. That's a long way. That's like going from here to Cincinnati or so. How do metals, heavy metals, metals that are in such high concentration that whenever there's a rainstorm you have fish kills, if you want to look for plants along a certain part of this river, forget it, they're not there. How do these contaminants get so far downstream? Maybe nanoscience can help us. Where are the heavy metals? If you go into these stream sediments and X-ray them, in some cases you get a lot of information. But is it any of any use? Okay, there's a lot of quartz there, there's a lot of feldspar there. Fine. But where are the heavy metals? Some cases you don't get any diffraction peaks at all in an X-ray diffraction pattern. Well, there's quartz, but what is this? If you put it in an SEM, 20 microns, 5 microns for scale, the resolution is not good enough to find out where the heavy metals are. Again, I ask the question, how are the heavy metals getting that far downstream? Answer, you have to go to a TEM. You have to make sections using ultramicrotome with a diamond knife, which is a real bear to do. But we do it, and occasionally we can be successful with these kinds of studies. And we find minerals that now contain the heavy metals we're interested in that we had no idea were there. In fact, we have minerals that I would never have predicted to be there had I been given 10 years to do it. Like a spinel. This spinel is actually growing under Earth's surface conditions. And when I found this thing in the TEM, this zinc, so there's our heavy metal, one of them that we're interested in, the zinc aluminum oxide. I went, wait a minute, this can't be right. This must have been in the ore body or something, because certainly we're not going to make this thing in a stream. And I looked in the literature, and finally, after a few months of searching, I found that some Japanese people in the 70s had actually grown spinels at room temperature and room pressure. Not this particular ones, but one's chemically similar. So I felt a lot better that you can make these things. And these are nanometer-sized crystals. It's 100 nanometers for scale. I don't know if you can see the little dots. I don't have any blow-ups in this talk, but these are about 1 to 5 nanometer-sized crystals. And their behavior, we know very little about. We don't really know their solubilities. We don't know what surface chemistries they promote. All we know is that they have the gondite structure, a typical spinel structure, and that they're carrying a metal. And no wonder they're getting 500 kilometers downstream. These are nanometer-sized particles. They will stay in a river, in turbulent current in a river, even in laminar flow in a stream, indefinitely. Another zinc-containing mineral that I never even heard of before I did diffraction on it in the TEM and determined that it was this. Very hydride. Let me, in the interest of time here, let me just skip to the one of the last slides. Lead. Lead is a toxic metal in these systems that we're really super interested in, obviously, because it's so toxic. Finally found a mineral that contains lead in this system, in this Clark Fork system. Plumbojarosite. Jarosite is an iron sulfate. That didn't surprise me at all to find jarosite. It's found in many acid mine drainage sites. But this, we found lots of jarosites that have lead in the structure. The mineral is called plumbojarosite. And the interesting thing about this is that this material is relatively stable at low pHs, or we think it is. We don't know when you get to super small crystals what its solubility is at low pHs, but it's another PhD project to do. When this material becomes unstable at pHs of about 4, it will start to dissolve. As the pHs rise to about 4 or a little bit higher, this stuff will start to dissolve. And of course, the lead will be released to solution in the aqueous state, and it will become very bioavailable to kill fish and that sort of thing. Well, it turns out that ferrihydrite, of which there is a lot of in this area, and this is definitely a nanomaterial. These crystallites of ferrihydrite are very much in the nano domain, about 1 nanometer in size. In fact, the surface area of ferrihydrite is about 600 square meters per gram. Can you believe that? 600 square meters per gram. Ferrihydrite, which in this particular slide is sorbing zinc, silicon, aluminum, and copper. Certainly other materials we're interested in. But no lead. There's no lead, even though ferrihydrite loves lead. When you look at experiments that have been done in laboratory of percent metal absorbed versus pH, this is lead on ferrihydrite. These are absorption curves for lead absorbing onto ferrihydrite. As the pH goes up, the absorption of lead on the ferrihydrite surfaces goes up sky high. But there's no lead here. But that's because we're at the wrong pH. And as soon as this material starts to break down at about pH of 4, and the lead becomes aqueous, and then the pH goes up above 5 as it's continually being buffered in this system as we go downstream, then the ferrihydrite will take up lead. And then as the fish is going to die because of it, it's got to suck in the ferrihydrite in its gills. And there will be the lead on its surface. And so this is just one snapshot, one simple example of how you can do quite practical things looking at the nanoscale all the way through. Okay, to end the talk then, I'm going to go back to the original question. How will the Earth and environmental sciences respond to this tremendous interest in this field, which many people that track this sort of thing, scientific historians, has put on the scale of the revolution in biology, specifically genomics and proteomics. And we all know what that's meant to society and how it's been funded. Speaking of funding, here's the year 1970, 80, 90, 2000, U.S. budget in billions of dollars for the life sciences. Most of this is National Institute of Health. Well above $15 billion annually now. This is inflation adjusted. And the good old physical sciences, of which we're a small part, has gone absolutely nowhere. Probably not for much longer. I don't know if you've been listening to the news lately on these sorts of things, but in this very city, in just the last few weeks, not only Democrats but Republicans are talking about dramatic increases in scientific funding for this. Why is that? I think it's very clear. It's nanoscience and technology that they're after. It's because they know that the driver of our economy right now is the fundamental physical science discoveries that were made in the 60s and 70s, sort of the post-Sputnik era and computing. And the economic driver in the next few decades is going to be nanoscience and technology, from quantum computers to quantum dots to you name it. So, in Clinton's term, at the very end, he started with his science advisor the National Nanotechnology Initiative. It just started 2 years ago. Before 2 years ago, it had 0 in it because it didn't exist. And now, 2 years later, this year, this fiscal year, it's got over $600 million in it. And next year, it's going to be in the $700 million range. I've been asked by colleagues, so what? I mean, what does this have to do with the earth sciences? I think it has a lot to do with the earth sciences. And I think that it's visionary people like David Lambert at the National Science Foundation and Nick Woodward at the Department of Energy that are seeing the opportunity that we have in nanoscience and technology, that it does have a home in the earth sciences, that we can not only do fundamental science like I've talked to you about, but we can do practical science. We can do earth monitoring systems, environmental monitoring systems, using nanoscience. And that it really does deserve, even in the earth sciences, huge amounts of increased and new funding. So, the short response here to this curve is that it could very well start doing this. And this is because politicians, because of this nanoscience phenomenon that's going on right now. They're talking about doubling the NSF budget in the next 5 years. And before, it was just us scientists talking about that and maybe Rita Colwell talking about it behind closed doors. Now, they're talking about it a couple miles from here in appropriations committees. There's a big difference there. And this could very well happen. If not next fiscal year, maybe 1 or 2 from now. So I think the future is bright. I think that nanoscience and technology is in fact, the next revolution, or one of the next revolutions in the earth sciences. And it's been a great pleasure to be here. Thanks very much again, Rod. Thanks, Bob. And see you later. Thanks.
We'll take just a few moments for questions.
Question about nanomechanics. Is that pretty much different than the general theory of using it? If you're calculating general mechanics?
Yeah. The question is about nanomechanics and whether it's very different from macro mechanics and the equations that describe macro mechanics. Good question. We can't answer that right now. I suspect that there are similarities and I suspect that there are differences. These particular curves were modeled using what we call a worm-like chain model, which is definitely not our discovery, but it's mechanical physicists that study the stretching of protein molecules. You take a polypeptide chain and you come up with an equation that describes the stretching of that chain. And it's a remarkably simple equation. But when Stephen applied it to these curves, they fit. So there you go. So I'm sorry, I can't answer your question, but that I suspect, again, that there are some differences and some similarities. Thank you.